Hi Year 10, I am going to try and do a super speedy talk through all 15 of your power and conflict poems. Obviously, you studied 6 of these in Year 9. We'd studied probably 4 or 5 of them together before we went into lockdown, and I've been setting them on the GCSE pod. If you haven't been accessing pod, then I suggest you go in and access the old assignments. They're still there. Most of them are just multiple choice. You can obviously access all of the poems on your Google Classroom or just put them into Google, they're all there. You'll also find all of the poems on Genius, fully annotated. So again, another place to look for revision. And good old Mr. Brough has produced some extended lectures on every single one of those 15 poems. So here they all are, and it's a quick run through of all 15. So across the top of the screen there, you can see the themes. There are only so many themes, and you can see different poems fall into more than one category. So we've got power of nature, humans, conflict, loss and absence, memory, and then we've got the emotions: anger, guilt, fear and pride, identity, and individual experience. So when you're expecting an exam question, expect it to be on one of those themes. One of the poems will be named, it will be right there for you. You can look at it, read it, annotate it, and write about it in depth. The second poem that you compare to has to be cemented in your memory. So you need to know, you need to have enough knowledge of these poems to be able to pick a good comparison choice. You don't have to write about them 50-50, you already know this. So the poem that's in front of you, if you feel confident with it, 70% on that, 30% on the other, that's fine. If you've got one in your head that you feel super confident with and the one that's named is not your favourite, you can do more on that one. 50-50 is great, 60-40 would be fine, 70-30 would be fine. Ultimately, as long as you compare, you will be okay. Even if the comparison is small, I would hope that it wouldn't be small, but even if the comparison is just a couple of paragraphs, it counts as a comparison. What you mustn't do is only write about one poem, because that is a rubric infringement and it puts your grade right down. So even if the quality of your writing was fantastic, if you only write about one poem, it will knock your grade right down. So you must write about 2 poems. So here we go. Here is poem 1, Kamikaze. We did cover this one in class. Context is Japanese kamikaze pilots flying planes into US warships in World War II. It was a great honour to be a kamikaze pilot. See ideas about indoctrination. The idea that the pilot has been indoctrinated by those in power. It's looking at power and authority and how they can use their own propaganda to create an agenda to get people to do what they want. Form and structure, the title gives us an indication of the context. It's written from a dual perspective. Italics signify granddaughter, and the normal text is this omniscient narrator. Most importantly, we do not hear the voice of the pilot, because we know that when the pilot returned, he was shunned from society. So again, it creates this theme of isolation and this conflict between the pilot and his family. Got some natural imagery in there. We know that it is the beauty of nature that turns him around. He looks down upon the world. He sees the shoals of fishes flashing silver. You've got quite a few references to precious stones like the opal and the silver. And that reminds the pilot about the beauty of nature and the power of memory. And that's what turns him round. We see at the start that he is indoctrinated. He is the soldier with his flask of water and the samurai sword. But when he looks down, we have the symbolism of the figure of 8. So he sees the fishes swimming in the figure of 8. We said the figure of 8 could represent the flag, so that linked to nationalism, the flag of identity. But we also said it could link to the idea of surrender, giving up on something. The fish is going round. He's going on a one-way journey into history. So that idea again of the propaganda that he's going to make his mark on history. But when he returned, he was no longer the father we loved, and she had to wonder what would have been the worst death. Was it, would it have been better to have died in conflict, or to face this social death which he faces upon his return? So we've got ideas about power and abuse of power, indoctrination, propaganda, the power of nature, and actually how ultimately his act is an act of heroism. He chooses not to kill people, and yet he comes back as a villain. So we've got some key themes: nature, conflict, loss and absence, identity, memory, and personal conflict. So here is our second poem. It's not prelude. What is our second poem? I'm going backwards. Sorry, here is our second poem, and it is Poppies by Jane Weir. So Poppies is a poem which obviously links to the theme of remembrance and war. Um, we see the mother's perspective, the parental perspective, and it shows us the idea that war does not just affect the soldiers who go off, but it also affects the families who are left behind. And we see that conflict um, with the mother wanting to keep hold of her child and keep him young, and all of her memories of sending him off to school and rubbing her nose against his nose and the Eskimo kiss, all these little maternal instincts, and how she's having to fight to hold those back as she lets him go off into the world. So it's not just about a son going off to war, but it's also about a son growing up and leaving home, and the mother being left behind. So we've got some time indicators: 3 days before, regular stanza and line length, alongside use of enjambment and caesura. We said that the caesura is her way of trying to keep her emotions together. She's keeping her emotions tightly inside, and all of the short um, bits of punctuation, the caesura, helps to show that she is really trying to hold that in. In terms of language, there were lots of domestic images, images of sewing, tucks, darts, and pleats. And again, it's showing that maternal instinct. She talks about bandaging her hand with sellotape to remove the cat hairs from his clothes. And again, the idea of the bandage is linking to violence, spasms of red, again, linking to the violence of war, that she wants to protect her son and keep him safe, but it's time for him to go off in the world. And he goes off into the world excited, but she's left behind a songbird released from a cage. So we know that she cries. And it's a really sad poem. There's a sense of loss at the end. You know, she's walking around the war memorial with no protection, no coat, no scarf. It suggests she's suffered a loss. And it's quite a bleak ending to the poem. But again, it shows um, the conflict of war and the effects of war on the soldiers and those left behind. Right, here is your next poem, The Prelude. Now, this is the Man Who's Scared of a Mountain poem. So, this is Wordsworth. It's a nature poem. Wordsworth was a romantic poet, which means he wrote about nature and tried to express true sentiments through that. He loved the Lake District, and this is a poem about the Lake District. It's partly autobiographical. It's an epic poem. It's one huge response. There's no stanzas. It's like a monologue style, so it starts peacefully but ends with a more intense atmosphere. And how the start of the poem shows the man's confidence as he steals the boat within an act of stealth and pleasure. And then as he approaches the mountain is personified. Okay, so we see the power of nature. It upreared its head, and he feels like he's been chased by this mountain. Now, it's showing us man's insignificance. You know, nature is the true power. Nature is mighty and huge, this huge peak, black and huge. It troubles him so much that he goes away and he's haunted by the memory, which obviously links to a poem like Remains. You know, the idea of being haunted or troubled by the experience, the realization that humans are just insignificant in the grand scheme of nature. It could also be seen as a poem that is symbolic of the start of the Industrial Revolution. So the beauty of nature being marred by the black and huge peak could be a symbol of industry and the factories that would pollute and sort of destroy aspects of nature which Wordsworth, like Blake, sort of despised. So the poem can also be seen as the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Right, War Photographer, this poem you've done several times. You should feel super confident with this. This is Duffy. It shows the universal suffering created by wars, and she references lots of different wars, each one punctuated with a full stop to highlight, you know, that war is universal. We see the photographer. We have this extended metaphor that he is like a priest, you know, intoning a mass. He's in his dark room developing his photos. Links to the idea that he feels a sense of responsibility to deliver a message, like a priest delivers a message to a congregation. the photographer feels a sense of duty to show the world the horrors of the things that he has seen. It's quite a sensory poem. You know, we've got spools of suffering, as if the spools themselves are suffering with the horrors of the things they've captured. We get the description of the death of the man that he captures, and how he seeks approval from that man's wife to do what he must. So you have that word must, linking to this idea of obligation, and the blood stained into foreign dust. So we have lots of horrifying imagery. We also have the reference of children running in a nightmare heat. So we have the allusion to the famous photograph, The Terrors of War, the Napalm Girl, and he juxtaposes that with references to rural England, you know, home again safe, um, and just to make us kind of appreciate that the beauty and the peacefulness of our country when there are horrors and atrocities going on around the world. And then the end of the poem, we see this disillusioned sense the photographer feels that ultimately the editor picks out a few shots that will sell the papers. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers, you know, that verb to prick with tears, a short, sharp pain, but then people get over it. The photographer feels they do not care, so he has to carry this guilt and this anger around, and just feels that people are apathetic. They just don't care about the suffering they see. So the poem highlights the horrors of war and how people are quite desensitized to it. Okay, London by William Blake. This is one of my favourite poems in the anthology. It's a really bleak, negative poem. It shows Blake is criticising those in power. He's anti-establishment. He's criticising the church, the monarchy, the government. He sees them as hypocrites, using and abusing their power to control the masses. It's a first-person narrative. You know, I wander through the charted streets where the charted Thames doth flow. Um, it's a lone voice walking through a city and just seeing misery at every turn. It's full of sensory imagery, the sounds of the crying, the sounds of the sighs, the children, the adults, everybody's suffering wherever he looks, whether it's the harlot, the child, the chimney sweep. The strict ABAB rhyme scheme helps to show the strict rules and the oppressive nature of London. Like everybody's being controlled, even the rhyme scheme is tightly controlled. And the irony that humans try to charter nature, like even the Thames has been chartered for barges and business and industry. And it's all about how humans are kind of destroying the environment and destroying each other. The imagery is quite violent, so he talks about running in blood down palace walls and the blights with plagues. The key line for me is the metaphor in the middle of the poem. Everywhere he looks, all he can hear are the mind-forged manacles. That's the idea that people have been oppressed and indoctrinated by those in power to do what those in power want them to do. It highlights class divide, and it highlights the conflict between those who have and those who have not. Okay, here is your next poem, My Last Duchess. So this is your Robert Browning poem. This is a poem that is about the individual experience and the power of one man. It's sort of semi-based on a real-life character, Duke Alfonso II in Italy, who was rumoured to have killed his wife. It's a dramatic monologue, and you feel like you're really dealing with a bit of a psychopath. He's very controlling. He's very dominant. It's iambic pentameter and full of rhyming couplets. It makes the speech seem prepared, rehearsed, and controlled. The person he's talking to never speaks, which again shows the idea that he's very arrogant and loves the sound of his own voice. We have an irony in this poem. He feels he controls her. He controlled her in life. He controlled her by having her killed. You know, he gave commands, and then all smiles stopped. He controls her image behind this curtain, and he controls the curtain. But I guess the fact that you have, I can't remember exactly how many lines because I don't have my copy in front of me, 56 lines maybe, of him talking about her, I would be asking, who's really controlling who here? Did he really control her? Or is she still controlling him now? And it's the fact that he could not tame his wife. She didn't do anything wrong. She was polite, she was friendly, she smiled at people, and yet his jealousy and his rage kind of grew in him, and he gave commands and had her killed. We see his arrogance. He feels she did not respect his 900-year-old name. She treated him the same as she treated everybody else. So we really see an abuse of power. We see again, we're looking at a patriarchal society, so a man controlling. And then the fearful thing is he's setting up his next marriage, so you kind of feel sorry for the future bride. He's a show off. He name drops all the time, the artist and the sculptor. But you have irony right at the end. You know, he talks about the sculpture of Poseidon taming the seahorse and how it was cast just for him. So it shows his ego and his arrogance. But there's an irony that Poseidon, this god, is taming a seahorse, but the Duke could not tame his wife and had to have her killed because he couldn't get her to do what he wanted her to do, which was to crush her spirit and to control her. So it's a poem where we see human power being abused. Okay, Remains. Again, this poem we've looked at loads. You should feel really confident with this. It's full of imagery. It's based on a real life soldier. You've seen the video of Guardsman Tromans talking about his experience. Um, it starts in media res. You're kind of just thrown into the action. It's really colloquial, chatty language, almost throwaway attitude. You know, oh, this one time and another time. You know, it was as if violence was part of their life. They kill this looter, and you've got that repetition of possibly armed, probably armed, possibly not. It eats away at the soldier, the guilt. You know, maybe he was armed, maybe he wasn't. It moves from the third person, the collective voice of we, the first person plural, sorry, this collective me and somebody else, and we all decided. And then it becomes really first person. So then we see the true aftermath, the guilt eating away at him. Um, Dream, and he's torn apart. He's haunted by the death of this looter, and we have this allusion to Macbeth at the end. You know, his bloody life in my bloody hands. It's an allusion to Macbeth, and it links to this theme of guilt. And the key theme here is obviously PTSD. That this soldier is traumatized. The drink and the drugs won't flush him out. You know, the idea of wanting to flush something away to get rid of it, but he can't. The memory stays, even though the soldier is long since dead. Okay, we have The Emigre by Carol Rumans. So, we have the poet born in London, a multicultural environment, a poem that explores modern conflicts and ideas about immigration from countries involved in conflict or tyranny. We don't get to find out which country it is, which adds to this universal sense of what it feels like to be forced to leave your country. Um, there's also the idea that this is maybe it is a poem about leaving your country and being an outsider somewhere new, and how conflict and war has destroyed her childhood home. But there's also the idea that this is a poem about childhood and the loss of childhood, that once you grow up, you know, you can't revisit childhood, you can't fly back there. It's just there in your memories. We have the motif of sunlight that runs right through. So even though this country is sick with tyrants and even though it's at war, um, the memory is sunlight clear to her. So it shows that no matter what's happened to it now, her memory of it is positive. It's a first person narrative, like she is telling the story. So again, it adds to that personal connection that she feels to her homeland. You've got quite a lot of childish imagery in there. So it talks about how, like a doll, the language spills out of her every coloured molecule. You know, she's got a passion um, for her country and her homeland, and the idea that even though she lives somewhere new now, you know, it's embedded within her. It's part of her. She personifies the city. So first personification of the city to be sick with tyrants, like the city is ill, but also her memory is this personified image that it comes to her on a plane. She takes it dancing through the street. She pets it and combs it and takes it dancing. She presents it like a pet or a doll or a lover. The imagery is very protective and caring, and it shows her positive memories of her city, even though now she is seen as this dark outsider. So there's a little bit of a dark end to this poem, which links to the theme of perhaps racism and conflict surrounding immigration. Okay, the Charge of the Light Brigade. Charge of the Light Brigade, obviously based on a real event, the Battle of Balaclava, um, where we saw huge losses in the Crimean War. And Tennyson's poem was meant to honour the men It was, again, we see abuse of power here, or a mistake, because somebody high up gave the orders and the orders were a mistake. So someone had blundered, is the line. So the 600 men rode in. It shows the idea again about status and position. So the men at the bottom have no choice but to follow the orders. You know, theirs not to question why, theirs just to do and die. They just have to follow the orders. So we see that human power can have catastrophic events. There's a really strong rhythm which reflects the sound of the galloping horses that runs through this poem. You've got lots of repetition for effect. It's very sensory, so you've got cannons to the left, cannons to the right, the guns and the explosions, shot and shell going off. So it's very action packed. You've got metaphors as well, metaphors into the jaws of death, into the valley of hell. So it's very dramatic and it shows the absolute bravery of the soldiers. And the poem ends with, you know, when can their glory fade? Tennyson is giving you that question to say their glory should never fade. We should always remember and honour the sacrifice of these men. So it's a poem written to honour their suffering and to honour their loss, but it does highlight human power. It highlights how mistakes can be made and lives can be lost. Ozymandias, another poem like My Last Duchess, a poem about an individual. In this case, Ozymandias refers to Pharaoh Ramesses II. So Shelley was anti-monarchy and against governments, and you know, he saw them as corrupt. They thought they were invincible. They thought that their power would last forever, and we see this in the poem Ozymandias. So obviously, in this poem, the statue that stands in the desert is broken. It's gone. You know, he hears about it secondhand from a traveller. So it's not even a first-hand account, which instantly tells you that this pharaoh's power is dead and gone. It really doesn't matter anymore. What Shelley highlights, again as a romantic poet, is the absolute power of nature. It is nature which is the ultimate power. So Ozymandias had this statue built to honour his legacy as the King of Kings. You know, it shows his absolute arrogance, and yet his, you know, visage just lies cracked and broken in the ground amongst two trunkless legs. Hardly anything remains of this statue. So what we really get to see is that human power is really fleeting, it's really short lived, whereas the power of nature is endless and infinite. Got some quotes here, you know, it's learn and level, boundless and bare. It reminds us of the vastness of nature and the insignificance of man. Okay, Exposure. Okay, this is quite a long poem again. The poet was a soldier in World War One and died in battle. He was very critical of those in charge during war and felt war was pointless. Now, this poem really contrasts to Charge of the Light Brigade, because in Charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson wasn't criticising those in power. It was a poem written to honour those in war, whereas Owen's poem is a criticism of those in power, and it doesn't show war as this noble event like Charge of the Light Brigade does. It shows the absolute brutal horror of war and the absolute pointlessness of it, which is reinforced by the repetition of the phrase "but nothing happens," which is repeated throughout this poem. That shows that they were just in this cycle of suffering, and the poem has this very regular rhyme scheme, which again shows the regular nature of the suffering. Um, you have a first person plural voice, again, our brains ache. So it's the soldiers as this collective, they're collectively suffering. And the enemy is not really the opposition army. The enemy in this poem is nature again. There's a common theme here that a lot of these poems are showing that Mother Nature is the ultimate power, and that human power is very fleeting. So it's the winds that knife us, it's the sudden successive flights of bullets. The poem is full of oral imagery, so imagery to do with sounds. You've got the sibilance there of the sudden successive flights. Mother Nature is personified through the snow, the clouds, the rain, the wind, and the soldiers are just losing hope and losing faith. And it's a really bleak and desperately desolate, sad poem that shows the horrors of war and the pointlessness of violence. And you could argue that, you know, is this Mother Nature's revenge? You know, humans are destroying Earth and destroying each other, and Mother Nature is kind of leveling the playing field to an extent. And another poem which shows us the power of nature, Storm on the Island. So Heaney's poem has this really conversational turn. It's present tense. It makes us feel like we are in the storm. You know, this could apply to anybody, anywhere. Again, it's about nature. You know, it is a huge nothing that we fear. And I think we're seeing more and more extreme weathers due to climate change and so on. The poem really taps into that. Politically, though, the poem could also be about Ireland. You know, he's an Irish poet. Stormont, which is the first, what is it, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 letters of the title. Stormont is the Northern Ireland government. So this could also be a reference to the Troubles in Ireland when we're looking at power and conflict. The poem is filled with military language and war imagery. So space is a salvo. We are bombarded by the empty air. We've got the simile that it spits like a tame cat turns savage. So it's all about the brutality of nature as it attacks. And there's this whole them versus the weather, so humans versus the power of nature. You know, they've built their houses squat. They're hoping that they can survive the storm, and the storm is attacking them. And it is strange because it is a huge nothing that we fear. So again, a poem that shows the absolute power of Mother Nature. Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. Again, another really powerful war poem. Hughes briefly served in the RAF before going to Cambridge University, and the poem is about trench warfare. It's a brutal poem. It starts with in media res, so the soldier suddenly he awoke. You've got this third person voice. Suddenly he awoke and was running. You know, he doesn't. He's just thrown from sleep into action, and it's quite horrifying. You know, he's carrying his gear and he's raw emotionally and raw physically. Um, he's just hammering forward towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. He's become a machine. He doesn't even know what he's fighting for anymore. Propaganda perhaps influenced him to go to war, but now he's lost all of his rhyme and reason for why he's there. Um, because they're luxuries that he can't afford to carry anymore. So he drops them. So it says dropped like luxuries, king, honor, human dignity, etc. You know, using that etc. at the end shows how insignificant these things are to him now. It's a fight for survival. We see the destruction of nature, and again, Hughes loved nature, so this poem isn't just about the destruction of humanity, but it's about the destruction of Mother Nature again. And we see that through the death of the yellow hare. You know, its mouth wide open, silent, it's dying a horrific death. And again, we see the you know the effects of humans upon each other and the effects of humans upon the earth. The poem is filled with loads of active verbs that shows struggling and suffering, and the idea that he's questioning his role there. You know, he almost stops. In what cold clockwork was he the hand pointing that second? You have this horological imagery of time, and this feeling that he's just a second hand on a ticking clock, and he suddenly feels really insignificant. And by the end, his terror's touchy dynamite. So again, referencing to time, he's like a bomb waiting to go off. So it's a really bleak poem, and shows how humans are being dehumanized through the experience of war. Checking out my history, I've done a lesson on this, which I will post. It's called Lockdown Lowdown 54321, and it is a 5-part lesson which runs through the poem. This is one of my favourite poems because it's completely different, and it obviously explores the idea of identity. I think this is a really topical poem right now with everything that's going on in the world with George Floyd's death, Black Lives Matter, the removal of statues to slave traders, the removal of TV shows which are deemed racist, TV shows featuring blackface. I think checking out my history more than ever is a really significant, important, and topical poem. So I would ask you to watch the lesson that I've put on there. But ultimately, Agard's poem is highlighting how very Eurocentric the education system is. You know, an education system created by a government that have one narrative and don't necessarily have enough doesn't have enough diversity within it. Who decides what you learn? You know, why do you learn about Florence Nightingale, but you don't learn about Mary Seacole? And why is your history so narrow? And this is an issue that's being pushed forward now by the Black curriculum, that we are living in a society that is still absolutely filled with institutional racism, and we need to be moving away from that to really be a just and fair society. We need to have a better understanding of the world, and history needs to be taught more effectively. And Gav's poem is angry because he feels like he's been blinded, so he's using that metaphor of blind to his own identity. He says his eyes have been bandaged up to his own history. So he feels like there's been a real disservice in his education. But the end is really positive because he juxtaposes these white historical figures with these black historical figures to show that there are different aspects, different people in the world to study and to learn about. And he's going to carve out his own identity. So the verb to carve implying that he's going to take time and he's going to dedicate himself to learn beyond the mainstream sort of education system. So again, to go against the conformist view and to actually learn for yourself, learn beyond what you've currently been taught. And Tissue, again, a tricky poem, one that I used to really dislike, but as time goes on, I really do like it more and more. And it's a really abstract poem, but again, with everything that's going on in the world today, I do feel like this poem has a really strong message now that life is short lived, it's ever changing. Um, Darker herself, when asked to describe this poem, she said to Mr. Richardson when he asked her, she said that we live through impermanence. And here we are in a global pandemic, living through impermanence. Everything we know um, and everything we used to do has completely changed. Here I am teaching a lesson through a PowerPoint because I can't be in a physical classroom with you guys. Everything has changed. So we really do live through impermanence. And this poem makes us think about what really matters to us. Is it the structures we leave behind, or is it the little handwritten notes in the back of a book? So she says she was inspired after seeing this little note that her dad had written in the back of a book, and seeing his beautiful handwriting. It provoked this memory and this sense of identity. And I think I told you guys that I started to fill in a baby book for my daughters, and I thought it was really boring. So I started to write on the back of photographs and letters and things like that, just to capture little moments of time and history. And these are the things that shape our identity. The poem as well has this motif of sunlight that runs through, which again links to the power of nature, that nothing built by a human will last forever. If it was built from paper, we would see it shift, we would feel it fall. There's that little link to 9/11, that when the towers fell and all of the bricks and all of the materials and the papers that flew through the sky, we realised that human structures are never built to last. Same as human life. The quote, raise a structure never meant to last, which sorry guys, which to me links to this idea of human life being really short lived. It's not meant to last forever. We're not meant to leave a lasting legacy. We're meant to live in the here and now and enjoy the moment and enjoy the experience of life. And I think, yeah, that is the end of the slideshow. So that's not bad. All 15 poems, 33 minutes. Pause, use, make notes. But there you have your revision session on the poems.